The dusty gravel crunched under worn leather boots as Jake Thompson adjusted his weathered cowboy hat against the blazing Montana sun. At 28, his hands already bore the calluses of a man who'd spent his life working cattle, mending fences, and keeping his family's struggling ranch afloat. The morning light revealed the fading paint on the old barn and the patches in the pasture fence that needed replacing. But Jake had learned to see beauty in the imperfection. His grandfather used to say that character was like a good saddle. It only got better with age and hard use. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake checked his wallet one last time before heading into town. $37 in a crumpled receipt from the pharmacy, where he'd picked up his grandmother's heart medication. The prescription costs had tripled this year, but Martha Thompson was the only family he had left, and he'd walk through fire before letting her go without the care she needed. The Lazy H Ranch wasn't bringing in enough to cover the mounting medical bills, but somehow he always found a way to make ends meet. His grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, and now it was his turn to take care of her. The truck's engine rattled as he drove down Main Street, past the Blue Moon Diner where Lucy Chen was already setting up for the breakfast rush. She waved through the window, and Jake touched the brim of his hat in response. This was Copper Creek, Montana, where neighbors still looked out for each other, and a man's word was his bond. The town had seen better days since the big cattle operations moved in, but the spirit of the place remained unchanged. Jake couldn't imagine living anywhere else, even if staying meant watching his bank account dwindle month by month. As he parked outside the feed store, Jake noticed a sleek black sedan with Colorado plates pulled over on the side of the road. Steam was rising from under the hood, and a woman stood beside it, looking completely out of place in her expensive business attire. Without a second thought, Jake pulled his truck over and stepped out. His grandfather had taught him that when someone was in trouble, you didn't just drive by. You stopped and offered help. No questions asked. The woman looked up as he approached, and Jake was struck by something in her eyes, a weariness that went deeper than just car trouble. She was beautiful, but there was a sadness about her that seemed to dim everything around her. When she tried to smile at his approach, it looked like an expression she'd forgotten how to wear properly. That's when she said the words that would change everything. "I haven't really smiled in years." The confession came out almost by accident, as if the Montana air had loosened something inside her that had been locked away for too long. Jake Thompson had always believed that sunrise was God's way of giving the world a fresh start. As he stepped out onto the wraparound porch of the Thompson family homestead, coffee mug in hand, he watched the golden light spill across the rolling pastures of the Lazy H Ranch. The property had been in his family for 4 generations, and despite the financial struggles that kept him awake at night, he couldn't imagine calling anywhere else home. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres of some of the prettiest country Montana had to offer, with the Rockies standing sentinel in the distance like ancient guardians, watching over his small corner of the world. The morning routine never changed. Jake would rise before dawn, check on the cattle, inspect the water troughs, and make sure the fence lines were secure. Every morning brought new challenges: a sick calf, a broken gate, equipment that chose the worst possible moment to break down. But these were the kinds of problems his hands were made for, the sort of honest work that his grandfather had taught him to embrace rather than curse. Thomas Thompson had built this ranch from nothing, starting with a small herd and a dream bigger than his bank account. Now it was Jake's turn to carry on that legacy, even if the odds seemed stacked against him. The cattle market had been brutal for the past 2 years, with prices dropping just as feed costs skyrocketed. The big corporate operations could weather the storm, but family ranches like the Lazy H were hanging on by a thread. Jake had already sold off 200 acres to pay for his grandmother's surgery the previous year, and the remaining land was mortgaged to the hilt. The bank manager, a decent man named Robert Hayes, had been patient so far, but patience only stretched so far when numbers didn't add up on paper. Jake understood the business side of things, but understanding didn't make the reality any easier to swallow. Martha Thompson emerged from the kitchen, moving slowly but with the dignity that had carried her through 7 decades of Montana winters. At 73, she still insisted on making breakfast every morning, though Jake could see the effort it took her now. The heart condition had slowed her down considerably, but her spirit remained unbroken. She'd been the backbone of the Thompson family since Jake's grandfather passed 5 years ago. And even now, with her health failing, she refused to be anything but a source of strength for her grandson. "Coffee's getting cold," she called out, though her voice carried the warmth that had comforted Jake through every skinned knee and broken heart of his childhood. Martha had a way of making even the hardest days feel manageable with her quiet wisdom and unshakable faith that things would work out as they were meant to. She taught him that worrying was just interest paid on trouble that might never come. Though lately Jake found that particular piece of advice harder to follow than usual. The medical bills were piling up faster than hay bales in August. The specialist in Billings had recommended a new treatment that wasn't covered by her insurance. And the monthly cost was more than Jake cleared in a good month at the cattle auctions. He'd taken on extra work wherever he could find it, helping neighboring. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ranchers during calving season, breaking horses for the local rodeo circuit, even picking up shifts at the lumber mill when his schedule allowed. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford when it came to keeping his grandmother healthy and comfortable. Ben Rodriguez pulled up the gravel drive in his battered pickup, sending a cloud of dust into the morning air. Ben had been Jake's best friend since they were kids getting into trouble at Copper Creek Elementary, and now he ran a smaller spread about 10 miles east. The two men had weathered every storm together, from their first broken hearts to the deaths of their grandparents. And Ben's arrival meant either good news or the kind of problem that required two people to solve. Given the expression on his friend's face as he climbed out of the truck, Jake suspected it wasn't good news. "Morning, Martha," Ben called out, removing his hat as he approached the porch. He'd been raised right, with the kind of old-fashioned manners that were becoming rarer with each passing year. Martha Thompson had been like a second grandmother to him, feeding him countless meals and patching up his injuries when his own family was too busy working to pay attention to a scraped-up kid. "Ben Rodriguez, you look like you haven't eaten in a week," Martha scolded, though her eyes twinkled with affection. "Sit yourself down and I'll fix you a proper breakfast." Growing boys need more than coffee and regret to keep them going. At 29, Ben was hardly a growing boy anymore, but Martha Thompson still saw the children they'd once been in the men they'd become. Jake studied his friend's face, recognizing the telltale sign of a man carrying heavy news. "What's eating at you, Ben? You look like someone stole your favorite horse and left you with the vet bill." The attempt at humor fell flat when Ben didn't even crack a smile. Whatever was troubling him, it was serious enough to override his usual easygoing nature. "Hayes Industries made an offer on the Jameson place yesterday," Ben said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the morning breeze. "3 times what the land's worth for agricultural use. Old Pete's thinking about taking it." The news hit Jake like a punch to the gut. The Jameson Ranch bordered both the Lazy H and Ben's property, and its sale to a development company would change the character of the entire valley. Pete Jameson had been ranching these hills for 40 years. But at 68, and with no children to pass the ranch to, the offer probably looked like a golden ticket to retirement. Martha set down her coffee cup, with a sharp clink that spoke volumes about her feelings on the matter. "Pete Jameson selling to developers. I never thought I'd see the day." His daddy would roll over in his grave, knowing that good pasture land was going to become some fancy resort for city folks who think milk comes from a carton, and beef grows on trees. Her voice carried the weight of watching too many changes come to a place that had remained constant for most of her life. The three of them sat in contemplative silence, watching the cattle graze in the distance. Each knew what the other was thinking. If Pete sold to Hayes Industries, it would be the beginning of the end for the traditional ranching community that had defined Copper Creek for generations. The developers would come in with their money and their plans, transforming working ranch land into luxury resorts and vacation homes for wealthy outsiders who would never understand what they'd destroyed in the process. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from Doc Williams, the local veterinarian who'd been treating both animals and offering amateur medical advice to humans for as long as anyone could remember. The message was brief, but concerning. Got a call about some horses in distress out on Highway 87. Might need an extra pair of hands if you're available. Jake stood immediately, draining his coffee cup. A call from Doc Williams about animals in distress wasn't a request. It was an obligation that every decent person in Copper Creek understood without question. Duty calls, Jake said, grabbing his hat from the porch railing. Martha, take your medication and don't overdo it today. Ben want to tag along. Doc might need more help than I can provide. The three of them had responded to similar calls before, whether it was helping with a difficult calving or rescuing horses from a barn fire. In a community where everyone depended on everyone else, lending a hand wasn't charity, it was survival. The drive to Highway 87 took them through some of the most beautiful country in Montana, past rolling hills covered in native grass and dotted with cattle. This was the landscape that had called to Jake's great-grandfather over a century ago, drawing him west with promises of freedom and the chance to build something lasting. Now that legacy hung in the balance, threatened by forces beyond Jake's control, but not beyond his determination to fight. As they crested a hill, Jake spotted the source of Doc Williams' concern. A luxury sedan with Colorado plates sat disabled on the shoulder of the road, steam rising from its engine like a distress signal. A woman stood beside the vehicle, and even from a distance, Jake could see that she was completely out of her element. Her business attire looked expensive and impractical for the Montana countryside, and her posture suggested someone unaccustomed to being stranded without immediate solutions at her fingertips. Jake pulled his truck over without hesitation, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory. A man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to give to help someone in need. The woman looked up as he approached, and Jake was immediately struck by something indefinable in her expression. She was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive salons and designer everything. But there was a sadness in her eyes that seemed at odds with her obvious prosperity. "Looks like you're having some car trouble," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, unimpressed by expensive clothes or fancy cars. "I'm Jake Thompson, and this is my friend Ben Rodriguez. We know our way around engines. If you'd like us to take a look." The woman seemed momentarily taken aback by the offer of help, as if kindness from strangers was an unexpected experience. "I'm Victoria," she said, and Jake noticed that she hesitated slightly before giving her name, as though she wasn't entirely comfortable with the identity she was presenting. "I was driving to Copper Creek when the engine started making terrible noises, and then just died. I'm afraid I don't know much about cars." Jake popped the hood and immediately diagnosed the problem: a burst radiator hose that had left the engine overheated and the cooling system empty. It was a simple fix that would take about 20 minutes and cost less than $30, but without the right knowledge and tools, it might as well have been rocket science. "Good news is it's not serious," he told Victoria, already mentally inventorying the supplies in his truck. "Bad news is you'll need a tow to get to town, or I can fix it right here if you don't mind waiting." "You'd do that?" Victoria asked, and something in her voice suggested that random acts of kindness were not a regular feature of her world. "I mean, I can pay you for your time and trouble. I know you probably have more important things to do than help a stranger with car problems." The offer of payment hung in the air between them, and Jake could see Ben's eyebrows raise slightly. In Copper Creek, you didn't offer to pay neighbors for lending a hand. It was just something people did for each other. "No payment necessary," Jake said firmly, already reaching for his toolbox. "Around here, we help folks because it's the right thing to do, not because there's money in it. Besides, leaving a person stranded on the highway wouldn't sit right with my grandmother. And Martha Thompson's opinion carries a lot more weight than any payment you could offer." As he worked on the radiator hose, Jake found himself stealing glances at Victoria, puzzled by the contradiction between her obvious wealth and the melancholy that seemed to surround her like a shadow. Ben struck up a conversation with Victoria while Jake worked, his natural friendliness drawing out small details about her supposed reason for visiting Copper Creek. She claimed to be a business consultant taking some time off to explore small-town Montana. But something about her story didn't quite ring true. Her hands were too soft for someone who worked with them, her clothes too expensive for a simple vacation, and her general air of sadness too profound for someone supposedly on a leisurely trip. As Jake tightened the last connection on the new radiator hose, Victoria made a comment that would stick with him for days to come. "You know," she said quietly, watching him work with obvious admiration, "I can't remember the last time someone helped me without wanting something in return. In my world, every kindness comes with a price tag attached." The words were spoken so softly that Jake almost missed them, but when he looked up, he saw something vulnerable and raw in her expression that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "Well, you're in Montana now," Jake replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Different rules apply out here. We judge folks by their character, not their bank account, and we help each other, because that's how communities survive. Your car should run fine now, but you might want to have it looked at by a real mechanic when you get to town. Lucy Chen at the Blue Moon Diner can point you towards someone trustworthy." Victoria started to reach for her purse again, but Jake held up a hand to stop her. "I told you, no payment necessary. But if you really want to return the favor, stop by the diner sometime and tell Lucy that Jake Thompson sent you. She makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, and the coffee's strong enough to wake the dead. A recommendation from someone like you might mean more business for her, and that's worth more than any money you could offer me." As Victoria climbed back into her repaired car, she turned to Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I haven't smiled, really smiled, in years," she said, the confession tumbling out as if the Montana air had loosened something inside her that had been locked away for too long. "But watching you work, seeing how you and Ben just stopped everything to help a complete stranger, it makes me remember what genuine kindness looks like. Thank you for that reminder." Jake watched her drive away, puzzled by the encounter and the lingering sadness in her voice. Ben climbed back into the passenger seat of Jake's truck, shaking his head with a thoughtful expression. "That's one complicated woman," he observed. "Pretty as a picture, but carrying around enough emotional baggage to sink a ship. What do you suppose her real story is?" "Don't know," Jake replied, starting the engine and pulling back onto the highway. "But something tells me we haven't seen the last of her. And did you notice, she never did say exactly what kind of business consulting she does, or why she's really here in Copper Creek. City folks don't usually choose our little corner of nowhere for vacation destinations, unless they're running from something or looking for something they lost." The encounter left Jake with questions he couldn't answer, and a strange feeling that his quiet life in Copper Creek was about to become considerably more complicated. As they drove back toward town, he found himself thinking about Victoria's confession, how someone so obviously successful could claim not to have smiled genuinely in years. It seemed impossible that anyone could live without the simple joy that Jake found in everyday moments like sunrise over the ranch or his grandmother's laughter at the breakfast table. What Jake didn't know was that Victoria Hayes, heir to a billion-dollar development empire and CEO of the very company threatening to transform Copper Creek forever, had come to Montana on a mission of her own. Burned by too many relationships built on greed rather than genuine affection, she decided to test whether authentic people still existed in a world that seemed increasingly focused on profit margins and personal gain. Her broken-down car hadn't been an accident but a carefully orchestrated opportunity to observe how strangers would treat someone they believed to be powerless and in need of help. But as Victoria drove toward Copper Creek, still thinking about Jake's calloused hands and genuine smile, she realized that her simple test had become something far more complicated. For the first time in years, she'd encountered someone whose kindness seemed completely authentic, whose help came without conditions or expectations. The corporate executive who had built her success on reading people and understanding their motivations found herself completely unable to categorize Jake Thompson. And that uncertainty both thrilled and terrified her in ways she hadn't expected. The road to Copper Creek stretched ahead, winding through landscape that seemed unchanged since her great-grandfather's time, and Victoria began to understand why someone like Jake would fight to preserve this way of life. But she also knew that her company's plans for the valley were already in motion, and that her presence here, no matter how innocent it might seem, would inevitably bring those two worlds into collision. The question was whether the fragile connection she'd felt with Jake would survive the impact when it came. Part 2. The Blue Moon Connection. The Blue Moon Diner sat at the heart of Copper Creek like a warm beacon of community spirit, its neon sign flickering against the late afternoon sky. Jake pushed through the familiar door, the brass bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful chime that had welcomed locals for over 30 years. Lucy Chen looked up from behind the counter, her face breaking into the kind of genuine smile that made everyone feel like family the moment they stepped inside. The diner was more than just a restaurant. It was the unofficial town hall where news traveled faster than wildfire and friendships were forged over countless cups of coffee and slices of homemade pie. The checkered linoleum floors showed the wear of decades of boots and sneakers, while red vinyl booths lined the windows that offered perfect views of Main Street's daily rhythm. Photographs covered every available inch of wall space, chronicling the history of Copper Creek through generations of residents who had called this place home. There were pictures of cattle drives from the 1950s, high school football championships, wedding celebrations, and memorial services. The complete tapestry of small-town life preserved in fading color snapshots that told stories of triumph and heartbreak in equal measure. Jake slid onto his usual stool at the counter, nodding to old Pete Jameson, who sat 2 seats down nursing his daily cup of black coffee and working through the crossword puzzle in yesterday's newspaper. Pete had been coming to the Blue Moon for breakfast every morning since his wife Clara passed 3 years ago, claiming that Lucy's pancakes were the only thing that could get him out of bed these days. The routine had become as much a part of Copper Creek's daily rhythm as the sunrise itself, and Jake knew that Pete's absence would be one more sign that their tight-knit community was slowly unraveling. "You look like a man with something weighing on his mind," Lucy observed, already pouring Jake's usual coffee without being asked. She had an uncanny ability to read the moods of her regular customers, a skill developed through years of serving as unofficial therapist to half the town. Lucy had moved to Copper Creek 15 years ago from San Francisco, trading a high-stress career in technology for the slower pace and genuine connections that small-town life offered. Her decision to open the diner had been met with skepticism initially, but her combination of excellent food and genuine care for her customers had quickly made her an indispensable part of the community. "Just thinking about changes coming whether we want them or not," Jake replied, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. The coffee was strong enough to dissolve horseshoe nails, exactly the way he preferred it after long days in the saddle. "Ben told me about Hayes Industries making an offer on Pete's place. 3 times what the land's worth for ranching apparently." He kept his voice low, not wanting to add to the speculation that was probably already circulating through town like tumbleweeds in a windstorm. Lucy's expression darkened at the mention of the development company that had been circling Copper Creek like vultures for the past year. "Money talks, but it doesn't always say the right things," she said with the kind of quiet wisdom that came from observing human nature through countless conversations across her counter. "Pete's been ranching that land since before I was born, but I can't blame him for considering the offer. At his age, with no family to pass the ranch to, that kind of money probably looks like security for whatever years he has left." The bell chimed again, and Jake turned to see a familiar figure entering the diner. Victoria paused in the doorway, her expensive business attire standing out like a peacock among pigeons in the casual atmosphere of the Blue Moon. She seemed uncertain, as though she wasn't quite sure what the protocol was for entering a small-town diner where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were either welcomed with open arms or regarded with polite suspicion depending on their intentions. Jake stood and gestured toward an empty booth near the window, his natural courtesy overriding any curiosity about why the mysterious woman from the highway had decided to take his suggestion about visiting Lucy's establishment. "Victoria, right? I'm glad you decided to stop by. Lucy, this is the lady I was telling you about, the one whose car broke down on Highway 87. Victoria, meet Lucy Chen, the best cook in Montana and the unofficial mayor of Copper Creek." Victoria approached the booth with careful steps, her designer heels clicking against the worn linoleum in a rhythm that seemed oddly out of place among the familiar sounds of coffee percolating and bacon sizzling on the grill. She slid into the booth across from Jake, her movements carrying a precision that spoke of someone accustomed to being watched and evaluated. Lucy appeared almost immediately with a coffee pot and an extra mug, her natural hospitality taking precedence over any questions about the well-dressed stranger who clearly didn't fit the usual demographic of Blue Moon customers. "Welcome to the Blue Moon," Lucy said warmly, filling Victoria's cup with the kind of automatic efficiency that came from years of practice. "Any friend of Jake's is welcome here, and anyone Jake stops to help on the highway definitely qualifies as a friend in my book. He's got a reputation for not being able to drive past someone in trouble, even when he's got plenty of troubles of his own to worry about." The comment was made with obvious affection, but Jake noticed Victoria's expression shift slightly, as though the idea of someone helping others despite their own struggles was a foreign concept that required careful consideration. "Thank you," Victoria said, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug as though the warmth could somehow anchor her to this unfamiliar environment. "Jake was incredibly kind to stop and help me today. I'm not used to such generosity from strangers, especially when there's nothing in it for them. Where I come from, people usually have ulterior motives for their good deeds." The words carried a weight of experience that made Jake wonder what kind of world Victoria inhabited where kindness was automatically suspect. Lucy exchanged a quick glance with Jake, her expression conveying the kind of wordless communication that developed between people who had known each other for years. "Well, you're in Copper Creek now," she said with a smile that could have melted January snow. "Different rules apply here. We help each other because it's the right thing to do, not because we're looking for something in return. Speaking of which, have you eaten today? You look like someone who's been running on coffee and stress for way too long." Before Victoria could protest, Lucy was already bustling back toward the kitchen, calling out orders to her cook with the kind of confident authority that brooked no argument. Jake found himself studying Victoria's profile as she gazed out the window at Main Street, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her fingers drummed nervously against the table. There was something almost fragile about her despite her obvious success and sophistication, as though she was holding herself together through sheer force of will, rather than genuine confidence. "Penny for your thoughts," Jake said gently, following her gaze to where a group of local kids were racing their bicycles down the sidewalk, their laughter carrying through the diner's windows like music. "You look like someone who's carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and that's a pretty heavy load for anyone to manage alone." Voice carried the kind of genuine concern that Victoria hadn't heard in longer than she cared to remember. The sort of attention that wasn't calculating what it might gain from the interaction. Victoria turned back to meet his eyes, and for a moment Jake caught a glimpse of something vulnerable and raw beneath her polished exterior. "I was just thinking about how different this place is from what I'm used to," she said carefully, as though each word was being weighed before it was spoken. "In my world, restaurants are about being seen and making impressions. This place feels like it's about actually feeding people and bringing them together. There's something honest about it that I find both refreshing and terrifying." The observation struck Jake as oddly profound for someone who claimed to be a simple business consultant taking a vacation in rural Montana. Most tourists who wandered into Copper Creek were charmed by the quaint atmosphere but didn't possess the depth of insight to recognize the fundamental differences between authentic community and manufactured experience. Victoria's ability to articulate what made the Blue Moon special suggested a level of sophistication that went beyond her cover story. But Jake filed the thought away for later consideration. Lucy returned with a plate that could have fed a small army meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a dinner roll that was still warm from the oven. The aroma was enough to make even someone who wasn't hungry suddenly ravenous, and Jake noticed Victoria's eyes widen at the generous portion. "I hope you're hungrier than you look," Lucy said with a grin. "Because in my kitchen there's no such thing as a small serving when someone needs a good meal. Food is love, and love doesn't come in modest portions." Victoria took a tentative bite of the meatloaf and her expression transformed completely. A look of genuine surprise and pleasure replacing the careful neutrality she'd maintained since entering the diner. "This is incredible," she said. And for the first time since Jake had met her, her smile seemed completely natural and unguarded. "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal that actually tasted like someone cared about the person eating it rather than just impressing them with expensive ingredients and fancy presentation." The comment resonated with both Jake and Lucy, who exchanged another meaningful glance. In their experience, people who were genuinely impressed by simple, well-prepared food were either very young or had been living in a world where style consistently trumped substance. Victoria's reaction suggested the latter, which raised new questions about her background and what had brought her to Copper Creek in search of something she couldn't define but obviously recognized when she found it. Old Pete Jameson shuffled over from his usual spot at the counter, his curiosity finally overcoming his natural reserve around strangers. At 71, Pete had earned the right to ask direct questions without worrying about social niceties, and his weathered face carried the kind of authority that came from decades of hard-earned wisdom. "You're the young lady whose car broke down on the highway," he said, settling into the booth beside Jake with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been protesting the Montana winters for far too many years. "Pete Jameson," Jake said by way of introduction. "Meet Victoria. Pete's been ranching in this valley longer than anyone else still working the land. If you want to understand what makes Copper Creek special, Pete's your man. He's got stories that go back to when this was still frontier country and a handshake was more binding than any legal contract." Pete studied Victoria with the kind of direct assessment that made most people squirm, but she met his gaze steadily, apparently accustomed to being evaluated by men who wielded significant influence. "Business consultant, Jake tells me," Pete said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with intelligence that age hadn't dimmed. "What kind of business brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" "Most consultants I've met prefer big cities where the problems are complex enough to justify their fees." Victoria set down her fork carefully, and Jake could see her choosing her words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "I specialize in helping organizations understand the value of traditional practices versus modern innovations," she said. Which was technically true even if it didn't come close to describing the full scope of her actual responsibilities. Small communities like Copper Creek offer insights into sustainable business models that larger operations often overlook in their rush toward efficiency and profit maximization. The explanation was smooth and professional, but Jake noticed that it didn't really answer Pete's question about what specific business had brought her to their particular town. Most visitors to Copper Creek were either tourists attracted by the scenery or researchers studying rural economics, and Victoria didn't quite fit either category. Her clothes were too expensive for academic work, her manner too polished for casual tourism, and her interest in local practices seemed both genuine and oddly personal for someone conducting professional research. Pete nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he'd reached similar conclusions about the gaps in Victoria's story. "Well, you picked an interesting time to study our little community," he said, with the kind of dry humor that came from watching the world change in ways that weren't always improvements. "We're right in the middle of deciding whether to preserve our traditional way of life or sell out to progress, depending on how you want to define progress." Hayes Industries has been making offers that are hard to refuse, even for folks who never planned to leave. Jake saw Victoria's fork freeze halfway to her mouth at the mention of Hayes Industries, her carefully controlled expression flickering for just a moment before returning to professional neutrality. The reaction was so brief that someone not paying close attention might have missed it entirely. But Jake's years of reading cattle and horses had taught him to notice the subtle signs of tension and discomfort that most people tried to hide. Whatever Victoria's connection to the development company threatening Copper Creek, it was more personal than professional curiosity about rural business practices. Hayes Industries, Victoria repeated carefully, setting down her fork and reaching for her coffee cup with movements that seemed deliberately casual. I've heard of them, of course. They've been involved in several development projects throughout the Mountain West. What kind of offers are they making? If you don't mind me asking. From a professional standpoint, I'm curious about how outside companies approach rural acquisition strategies. Pete's laugh held no humor whatsoever, the sound carrying decades of frustration with corporate entities that treated family ranches like abstract investments rather than living legacies. Oh, they're generous enough with their money, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions that felt like betrayals even when they were necessary for survival. 3 times what the land's worth for agricultural use, cash on the barrel, no questions asked. Hard to argue with that kind of mathematics when you're looking at retirement without enough savings to last through a bad winter. Lucy had been listening to the conversation while refilling coffee cups and clearing tables, her movements carrying the kind of efficient grace that came from years of managing multiple tasks simultaneously. The problem isn't the money, she interjected, joining the conversation with the authority of someone who had become an integral part of the community despite being a relative newcomer. The problem is what happens after the money changes hands. Hayes Industries doesn't buy ranch land to keep it as ranch land. They're in the business of transformation, turning working landscapes into luxury experiences for people who can afford to pay premium prices for authentic Western atmosphere without any of the actual work or responsibility that comes with genuine ranch life. Victoria absorbed this information with the kind of focused attention that Jake associated with people who were accustomed to analyzing complex situations for hidden implications and long-term consequences. Her questions about Hayes Industries were sharp and well-informed, suggesting a level of familiarity with corporate development strategies that went beyond casual professional interest. When she asked about environmental impact studies and community consultation processes, Jake began to suspect that Victoria's background included more direct experience with large-scale development projects than her consultant cover story implied. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Doc Williams, whose emergency call had originally brought Jake into town that afternoon. Doc looked tired and frustrated, his usually cheerful demeanor dimmed by whatever he'd encountered during his veterinary rounds. He slumped into an empty chair at their table, accepting the coffee that Lucy automatically provided with the grateful expression of a man who had been dealing with problems that coffee couldn't solve but might at least make temporarily bearable. False alarm on the horse emergency, Doc announced, running a hand through his graying hair. Turned out to be tourists who panicked when they saw a mare lying down in a pasture. Didn't occur to them that horses sometimes rest in positions other than standing up. Took me 2 hours to convince them that the animal wasn't dying, just taking a nap in the afternoon sun. His frustration was directed more at the general situation than at the specific incident, reflecting the broader tensions that were developing between longtime residents and the increasing number of visitors who arrived with preconceptions about rural life that didn't match reality. Victoria listened to Doc's story with an expression that Jake couldn't quite interpret, something that might have been sympathy mixed with recognition. It sounds like you're dealing with people who have romanticized ideas about ranch life without understanding the practical realities, she observed. That kind of disconnect between expectation and reality can create problems for everyone involved. From the visitors who don't get the experience they were hoping for to the locals who have to deal with unrealistic demands and inappropriate responses to normal situations. The insight was both perceptive and diplomatically phrased, acknowledging the frustrations of the local residents without dismissing the tourists as completely ignorant or unreasonable. Jake found himself impressed by Victoria's ability to see multiple sides of a complex situation, even as he wondered why someone on vacation would have such a sophisticated understanding of the dynamics between communities and outside influences. Most business consultants he'd encountered were focused on efficiency and profit margins, rather than the subtle social factors that determined whether development projects succeeded or failed in the long term. As the evening wore on and the diner gradually emptied of its dinner customers, Jake found himself reluctant to end the conversation. Victoria had proven to be an engaging companion, asking thoughtful questions about ranch life and local history while sharing carefully edited stories about her own travels and experiences. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding what made Copper Creek special, and her questions revealed a depth of curiosity that went beyond superficial tourist interest in quaint rural customs and picturesque landscapes. When Victoria finally announced that she needed to find accommodations for the night, Jake and Lucy immediately launched into a discussion of the limited options available in a town that had never invested heavily in tourist infrastructure. The Copper Creek Inn had been closed for renovations since a kitchen fire the previous month, and the nearest chain hotels were more than an hour's drive away. Pete suggested the boarding house that Mrs. Anderson ran for traveling salesmen and seasonal workers, but even he admitted that the accommodations were basic and the clientele might not be what someone like Victoria was accustomed to experiencing. "You know what?" Lucy said suddenly, her expression brightening with the kind of inspiration that usually led to solutions that benefited everyone involved. "I've got a small apartment above the diner that I use for storage mostly. It's not fancy, but it's clean and comfortable, and it would give you a real taste of small-town life. Plus you'd be close to the best coffee in the county, which has to count for something in terms of convenience and quality of life." Victoria's acceptance of Lucy's offer surprised Jake, who had expected someone with her obvious financial resources to prefer the anonymity and standardized comfort of chain hotel accommodations. Her willingness to stay in a simple apartment above a small-town diner suggested either an adventurous spirit or a deliberate choice to immerse herself more fully in the community experience. Either way, it meant that she would be staying in Copper Creek longer than a simple overnight visit, which opened up possibilities for deeper conversations and connections that Jake found himself anticipating with an enthusiasm that caught him off guard. As they said their goodnights and Victoria followed Lucy up the narrow staircase to the apartment above the diner, Jake lingered for a moment on the sidewalk outside, looking up at the windows that were already glowing with warm light. Something about Victoria intrigued him beyond her obvious beauty and mysterious background. There was a quality of sadness about her that seemed at odds with her apparent success, and her confession about not having smiled genuinely in years haunted him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The drive back to the ranch gave Jake time to think about the day's events and the unexpected encounter that had introduced such an intriguing element of mystery into his routine existence. Victoria was clearly more than she appeared to be, but her interest in Copper Creek seemed genuine even if her reasons for being there remained unclear. Her questions about Hayes Industries had been particularly telling, suggesting knowledge and concerns that went beyond casual curiosity about development pressures facing rural communities. By the time Jake reached the Lazy H Ranch, he had made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and certainty. Whatever Victoria's real story was, whatever had brought her to Copper Creek, and whatever was causing the sadness that seemed to shadow her every smile, he wanted to help her find whatever she was looking for. His grandfather had always said that some people came into your life for a reason, and Jake had the strongest feeling that Victoria's arrival in his world was the beginning of something important, even if he couldn't yet imagine what form that importance might take. Part 3. Morning Revelations. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the Lazy H Ranch like a familiar blanket as Jake prepared for another day that would begin long before the sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. His morning routine had remained unchanged for years. Coffee first, then a walk through the barn to check on the horses and cattle, followed by an assessment of whatever repairs or maintenance tasks demanded immediate attention. This morning, however, his thoughts kept drifting to the mysterious woman sleeping above Lucy's diner, and he found himself wondering whether Victoria was the type of person who appreciated sunrises or if she was more accustomed to cityscapes viewed from climate-controlled penthouses. Martha Thompson emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs, her movements slower than they had been even a month ago, but her determination to maintain their morning ritual undiminished by the progression of her heart condition. She settled into her favorite chair on the front porch, the one that offered the best view of the sunrise and had been her husband's preferred spot for the 20 years before his death. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wild flowers mixed with the earthy aroma of horses and hay that defined the sensory landscape of ranch life. "You're thinking awfully hard for someone who hasn't had enough coffee yet," Martha observed, her voice carrying the gentle teasing that had been a constant throughout Jake's childhood and adolescence. She had an uncanny ability to read his moods and motivations, a skill developed through decades of raising children and grandchildren who thought they could hide their concerns behind stoic expressions and casual deflections. "Would this have anything to do with the young lady Ben mentioned you helped yesterday? The one with the fancy car and the sad eyes?" Jake accepted his coffee gratefully, using the time it took to settle into his own chair to consider how much he wanted to share about his encounter with Victoria. His grandmother was perceptive enough to detect evasion, but she was also respectful enough not to press for details he wasn't ready to discuss. The balance between family closeness and personal privacy had been carefully negotiated over the years, creating a relationship built on trust and mutual understanding rather than obligation and intrusion. "Her name's Victoria," Jake said finally, watching the horizon for the first hints of dawn. "Says she's a business consultant taking some time off to explore small-town Montana. There's something about her story that doesn't quite add up, but she seems genuinely interested in understanding what makes places like Copper Creek special. Lucy put her up in the apartment above the diner for the night, so I'll probably see her again today." Martha's knowing smile suggested that she had already formed her own conclusions about Jake's interest in their mysterious visitor, but she was wise enough to keep her observations to herself for the moment. Instead, she focused on the practical aspects of hospitality that had been ingrained in her since childhood. "Well, if she's staying at Lucy's place, she'll get a good introduction to how we do things around here. Lucy's got a gift for making people feel welcome without making them feel like they're being studied under a microscope. That girl's been a blessing to this community since the day she decided to trade her city life for our simple existence." The mention of Lucy's transformation from urban professional to small-town business owner reminded Jake of his own decision to stay in Copper Creek, rather than pursuing opportunities in larger cities where his agricultural business degree might have opened doors to more lucrative careers. Like Lucy, he had chosen authenticity over ambition, community over competition, and the result had been a life that felt meaningful even when it was financially challenging. The question was whether someone like Victoria could understand those choices or if she was merely conducting an anthropological study of people whose priorities were fundamentally different from her own. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel as Ben's pickup truck pulled into the yard. Earlier than his usual visiting time and with an urgency that suggested something more serious than a casual social call. Ben climbed out of the cab, holding a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had been wrestling with difficult decisions throughout a sleepless night. His friendship with Jake had been tested by various challenges over the years, but they had always been able to rely on each other for honest advice and unwavering support when external pressures threatened to overwhelm their individual resources. "Morning, Martha," Ben said, removing his hat as he approached the porch. His respect for Jake's grandmother was absolute, and he had never forgotten the countless times she had fed him, bandaged his injuries, and provided the kind of maternal guidance that his own busy parents had been too distracted to offer. "I hope it's not too early for a visit, but I've got some information that Jake needs to see before he makes any decisions about how to handle the Hayes Industries situation." Jake accepted the folder with a sense of foreboding that proved justified when he opened it to reveal detailed financial records and development plans that painted a comprehensive picture of Hayes Industries' expansion strategy throughout the Mountain West. The documents were clearly confidential, marked with legal warning. about unauthorized distribution and their presence in Ben's possession raised questions about how he had obtained information that should have been restricted to corporate executives and their legal advisors. "Where did you get this?" Jake asked, scanning pages that outlined acquisition targets, profit projections, and timelines for converting ranch land into luxury resort destinations. The scope of the company's ambitions was staggering, encompassing dozens of properties across multiple states and representing investments that totaled in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Copper Creek was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, but the plans for their community were detailed enough to reveal that Hayes Industries had been studying the area for much longer than anyone had realized. Ben's expression carried a mixture of pride and embarrassment as he explained his connection to the information. "My cousin Danny works in the legal department at Hayes Industries headquarters in Denver. He's been there about 6 months now, mostly doing document review and filing, but he's got access to the internal database where they keep their project files. Danny's not supposed to download anything, but he's been worried about what's happening to communities like ours, so he decided to take some risks to get us information we need to protect ourselves." The ethical implications of using stolen corporate documents were troubling, but Jake found himself too absorbed in the contents to worry about the source. The Hayes Industries' plans for Copper Creek were comprehensive and devastating, calling for the acquisition of at least 12 major properties, including several working ranches, the historic downtown district, and significant portions of the surrounding grazing land. The development timeline stretched over 5 years and included plans for luxury hotels, championship golf courses, exclusive residential compounds, and recreational facilities that would transform the character of the entire valley. Martha leaned over to examine the documents, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she studied financial projections that treated her lifetime home as a commodity to be purchased, developed, and marketed to wealthy outsiders seeking authentic Western experiences. Her reaction was typically understated but nonetheless pointed. "I'm sure they've also given careful consideration to where all the people who currently live here are supposed to go once their improvements are complete." The development plans included provisions for relocating existing residents, but the financial assistance offered was minimal, and the suggested alternative communities were hundreds of miles away from the support networks and economic opportunities that had sustained families in Copper Creek for generations. It was clear that Hayes Industries viewed the current population as an inconvenience to be managed rather than as stakeholders whose concerns deserved serious consideration. The corporate mindset that treated people as obstacles to profit was exactly the kind of thinking that Jake had spent his entire life trying to avoid. Ben pointed to a specific section of the documents that outlined the company's strategy for accelerating property acquisitions through targeted financial pressure and strategic partnerships with local lending institutions. "Look at this," he said, his voice tight with anger. "They're not just making generous offers to property owners. They're also working behind the scenes to make it harder for people to refuse those offers. They've got arrangements with banks to tighten credit requirements for agricultural loans, and they're lobbying for changes in tax assessments that would make it more expensive to keep land in agricultural use." The revelation that Hayes Industries was actively working to undermine the financial stability of the ranching community added a layer of maliciousness to their development plans that went far beyond aggressive business practices into the realm of deliberate sabotage. Jake felt his anger building as he read about strategies designed to force property sales through manufactured financial distress. Tactics that would destroy the lives and livelihoods of families who had spent generations building sustainable operations on the land that Hayes Industries wanted to transform into profitable entertainment venues. As they continued to review the documents, Jake began to understand the full scope of the challenge facing Copper Creek and similar communities throughout the region. Hayes Industries wasn't just another development company seeking profitable opportunities. They were conducting a systematic campaign to acquire control over vast areas of the Mountain West. using financial manipulation and political influence to overcome resistance from local communities that preferred to maintain their traditional ways of life rather than surrendering to corporate transformation. The morning sun was fully risen by the time they finished reviewing the most critical documents, and Jake felt as though the world had shifted around him while he wasn't paying attention. The casual conversation about Pete Jamison's potential property sale had been revealed as just one small piece of a much larger threat that could eliminate the Copper Creek community entirely within a few years. The stakes were higher than anyone had imagined, and the resources arrayed against them were far more substantial than a small ranching town could reasonably hope to match through conventional resistance. "We need to warn people," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge that could not be ignored. "Pete and the others deserve to know what they're really being asked to sign up for when Hayes Industries comes calling with their generous offers. These aren't just property sales. They're participating in the destruction of everything that makes this place worth preserving." Ben nodded grimly, but his expression suggested that he had already considered the challenges involved in sharing information that had been obtained through questionable means. "The problem is that we can't exactly hold a town meeting and announce that we've got inside information from stolen corporate documents. Danny could lose his job and face criminal charges if Hayes Industries figures out where the leak came from. We need to find a way to use this information without revealing how we got it." Martha had been listening to their discussion while studying the development plans with the kind of focused attention that had made her one of the most respected teachers in Copper Creek's history. Her understanding of human nature and community dynamics had been refined through decades of watching young people grow into adults who either embraced or rejected the values that had shaped their upbringing. When she finally spoke, her words carried the authority of experience and the wisdom of someone who had seen similar challenges overcome through careful planning and determined action. "You boys are thinking about this backwards," she said, setting down the documents and fixing them both with the kind of direct gaze that had convinced countless students to reconsider their life choices. "You don't need to tell people where this information came from. You just need to help them ask the right questions when Hayes Industries comes calling. Give them the tools to demand transparency and accountability, and let the company's own responses reveal what kind of organization they're really dealing with." The suggestion was both practical and ethically sound, providing a way to use their inside knowledge to protect the community without exposing Ben's cousin to retaliation or legal consequences. Jake began to see possibilities for organizing a coordinated response that could force Hayes Industries to operate more transparently while giving property owners the information they needed to make fully informed decisions about their futures. Their planning session was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching the ranch. This one unfamiliar and expensive sounding in a way that immediately put Jake on alert. A sleek black sedan with Colorado plates pulled into the yard, and Jake felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the car from the previous day's highway encounter. Victoria emerged from the driver's seat wearing clothes that were slightly more casual than her previous business attire, but still far too expensive and impractical for a genuine Montana ranch visit. "Well," Martha said quietly, her tone carrying a note of speculation that made Jake suspect his grandmother had already formed some preliminary theories about their mysterious visitor's true identity and motivations. "It appears that your new friend has decided to pay us a social call. I wonder what kind of business consultant feels the need to visit working ranches as part of her research into small-town economics and community development strategies." Jake stood to greet Victoria, but his mind was racing with questions about the timing of her visit and the implications of her presence so soon after their discovery of Hayes Industries' comprehensive plans for transforming Copper Creek. The coincidence seemed too convenient to be accidental, and he found himself wondering whether Victoria's arrival in their community was connected to the corporate threats they were just beginning to understand. Her interest in their conversation about Hayes Industries the previous evening took on new significance in light of what they had learned about the company's systematic approach to property acquisition. Victoria approached the porch with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain, both literally and figuratively. Her smile seemed genuine, but Jake noticed that her eyes were taking in details of the ranch with the kind of systematic attention that suggested professional rather than casual interest. The combination of her obvious nervousness and her apparent expertise in evaluating rural properties created a contradiction that added to his growing suspicions about her true identity and purpose in Copper Creek. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Victoria said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who was unsure of her welcome, but determined to proceed with whatever mission had brought her to the Lazy H Ranch. "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday's help, and Lucy mentioned that you might be willing to show me around a working ranch so I could better understand the realities of rural life versus the romanticized versions that most outsiders encounter." The request was reasonable and well phrased, exactly the kind of educational opportunity that Jake would normally be happy to provide for someone with genuine interest in understanding ranch operations. However, the timing of Victoria's visit, combined with her suspicious knowledge of development issues and her obvious discomfort with maintaining her cover story, made him reluctant to provide information that could potentially be used against the community he was trying to protect. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that trust was something to be earned rather than assumed, especially when the stakes were high and the consequences of misjudgment could be devastating. Martha Thompson, however, had reached different conclusions about their visitor's character and motivations. Rising from her chair with the kind of gracious authority that had made her a beloved figure in Copper Creek for over 7 decades, she extended her hand to Victoria with a warmth that surprised Jake with its immediate acceptance of someone who remained essentially a stranger with questionable credentials and suspicious timing. "Welcome to the Lazy H Ranch," Martha said, her voice carrying the kind of genuine hospitality that had been the foundation of Western culture since the frontier era. "I'm Martha Thompson, Jake's grandmother and the closest thing this ranch has to a historian. If you're truly interested in understanding what makes places like this special, then you've come to the right place. We've got stories that go back 4 generations, and we're always happy to share them with people who appreciate the value of authentic experiences over manufactured entertainment." Part 4: Ranch Life Lessons. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Lazy H Ranch as Jake led Victoria through the gate that separated the working areas of the property from the family homestead. Her expensive boots were completely unsuited for navigating the uneven ground and occasional patches of mud that characterized a real working ranch. But she followed him with determined steps that suggested a willingness to endure discomfort in pursuit of whatever information or experience she was seeking. The contrast between her obvious urban sophistication and the practical realities of rural life was stark. But Jake found himself impressed by her persistence in maintaining the facade of casual interest, despite the obvious challenges. The first stop on their impromptu tour was the main barn. Part 3: Ranch Life Lessons. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Lazy H Ranch as Jake led Victoria through the gate that separated the working areas of the property from the family homestead. Her expensive boots were completely unsuited for navigating the uneven ground and occasional patches of mud that characterized a real working ranch. But she followed him with determined steps that suggested a willingness to endure discomfort in pursuit of whatever information or experience she was seeking. The contrast between her obvious urban sophistication and the practical realities of rural life was stark. But Jake found himself impressed by her persistence in maintaining the facade of casual interest, despite the obvious challenges. The first stop on their impromptu tour was the main barn, a massive structure that had been built by Jake's great-grandfather using timber from the surrounding mountains and craftsmanship techniques that had been passed down through generations of ranching families. The building showed its age in the weathered wood and patched roof, but its fundamental soundness was evident in the way it had withstood decades of Montana winters and summer storms. Inside, the familiar sense of hay, leather and horses created an atmosphere that Jake found comforting but that seemed to overwhelm Victoria with its intensity and authenticity. "This is where we keep the horses during bad weather," Jake explained, leading her past stalls that housed the quarter horses and mustangs that were essential to the ranch's daily operations. "Each of these animals has been trained for specific tasks, from cutting cattle to navigating mountain trails that would challenge even experienced hikers. They're not just livestock. They're partners in everything we do here, and treating them with respect and understanding is fundamental to successful ranch management." Victoria approached one of the stalls with obvious caution, her movements suggesting someone who had limited experience with large animals and was acutely aware of her own vulnerability. The horse inside, a gentle mare named Sage who had been Jake's favorite mount for the past 5 years, extended her nose toward the unfamiliar visitor with the kind of curious friendliness that characterized well-socialized ranch horses. Victoria's instinctive recoil from the animal's approach revealed the depth of her unfamiliarity with rural life, despite her claims to be researching small-town economics and community development. "She's beautiful," Victoria said, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and nervous uncertainty. "I've never been this close to a horse before. In my world, animals are mostly decorative, pets that live in apartments and require professional grooming rather than partners in actual work. The idea of depending on another living creature for your livelihood is both fascinating and intimidating to someone who's used to controlling every variable in their environment." Jake found himself studying Victoria's profile as she watched Sage with obvious fascination, noting the way her carefully maintained composure slipped slightly in the presence of something genuinely wild and unpredictable. Her confession about never being close to a horse reinforced his growing suspicions about her background, since most business consultants who specialized in rural economics would have at least some exposure to agricultural operations and the animals that made them possible. Her reactions were those of someone encountering an entirely foreign world rather than someone conducting professional research in a familiar field. "Would you like to meet her properly?" Jake asked, opening the stall door and leading Sage into the barn's main aisle. The mare's movements were fluid and confident, displaying the kind of self-assurance that came from years of positive interactions with humans who understood and respected her nature. "Horses are excellent judges of character. They can sense things about people that we sometimes miss, and they're honest in ways that humans often aren't. Sage here has never been wrong about someone's intentions, which makes her opinion worth more than most references or recommendations." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she reached out to touch Sage's neck, her fingers making contact with the warm, living reality of an animal whose existence was so far removed from her urban experience that it might as well have been an alien creature. The horse accepted her tentative caress with patient tolerance, neither pulling away nor showing the enthusiasm she would have displayed for someone genuinely comfortable with animals. The interaction was polite but distant, like a formal introduction between strangers who shared no common language or cultural understanding. "She's so warm," Victoria murmured, her voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested genuine surprise at the basic reality of animal life. "I know that sounds stupid, but I've spent so much time in climate-controlled environments that I'd forgotten what it feels like to touch something that's truly alive and responsive. There's an honesty to animals that's both refreshing and terrifying when you're used to dealing with people who always have hidden agendas and ulterior motives." The comment reinforced Jake's growing conviction that Victoria's background included extensive experience with corporate environments where trust was rare and authenticity was often sacrificed to strategic advantage. Her fascination with the simple reality of honest interaction, whether with animals or people, suggested someone who had become disconnected from the basic human experiences that rural communities took for granted. The question was whether her interest in rediscovering those experiences was genuine, or whether it was part of a more complex agenda that she was concealing behind her consultant cover story. As they continued through the barn, Jake pointed out the various tools and equipment that were essential to ranch operations, explaining their purposes and demonstrating their use with the kind of casual expertise that came from a lifetime of hands-on experience. Victoria listened intently, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and genuine curiosity about the practical realities of managing a large-scale agricultural operation. Her inquiries about feed costs, veterinary expenses, and equipment maintenance suggested someone with a sophisticated understanding of business operations, even if she lacked direct experience with the specific challenges of ranching. "The margins are tight," Jake admitted as they examined a piece of hay-moving equipment that had been repaired so many times that replacement parts outnumbered original components. "Between feed costs, fuel prices, veterinary bills, and equipment maintenance, there's not much left over at the end of the year. Most family operations like ours survive on hope and stubbornness rather than sound financial planning, which makes us vulnerable to market fluctuations and unexpected expenses that larger operations can absorb without serious consequences." Victoria's expression grew thoughtful as she processed this information, her eyes taking on the focused look of someone analyzing complex data for patterns and implications. "What about economies of scale?" she asked, her question revealing a familiarity with business concepts that seemed inconsistent with her claimed status as a tourist seeking authentic experiences. Have you considered partnerships or cooperative arrangements with neighboring ranches to reduce costs and increase bargaining power with suppliers and buyers? The suggestion was both intelligent and practical, exactly the kind of solution that business consultants were trained to identify when analyzing operational inefficiencies. However, Jake also recognized that implementing such arrangements would require the kind of fundamental changes to traditional ranching culture that many families would resist, viewing cooperation as a threat to the independence and self-reliance that had defined their way of life for generations. Victoria's ability to identify viable solutions while remaining apparently unaware of the cultural obstacles to their implementation suggested someone with extensive corporate experience but limited understanding of rural social dynamics. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Mitchell, the ranch foreman who had been working for the Thompson family for over 15 years, and whose judgment Jake trusted implicitly. Tom approached them with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment, but his eyes showed the kind of wariness that experienced ranch hands developed around strangers whose presence couldn't be easily explained or categorized. His greeting was polite but reserved, acknowledging Victoria's presence without extending the automatic welcome that locals typically offered to genuine visitors. "Jake, we've got a situation with the fence line along the north pasture," Tom said, his tone indicating that the problem was serious enough to require immediate attention. "Looks like someone cut through the wire sometime during the night. Could be vandalism, could be someone trying to make it easier for cattle to wander onto adjacent property. Either way, we need to get it fixed before the herd realizes there's an opening they can exploit." The news of deliberate fence damage added an ominous note to what had been a pleasant morning, raising questions about whether the incident was random mischief or part of a more systematic effort to create problems for the ranch. Jake's mind immediately went to the Hayes Industries documents that Ben had shared earlier, particularly the sections outlining strategies for applying pressure to property owners who were reluctant to sell. Sabotage might be too strong a word for fence cutting, but it was exactly the kind of low-level harassment that could make ranch operations more difficult and expensive while maintaining plausible deniability. Victoria's reaction to the news was subtle but telling, a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the incident had significance beyond simple vandalism for someone in her position. Her questions about the frequency of such problems and the ranch's security measures revealed a level of concern that seemed disproportionate for a casual visitor. Unless she had reasons to worry about the stability and safety of the operation that went beyond tourist curiosity about authentic ranch experiences. "This kind of thing has been happening more often lately," Tom continued, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who prided himself on maintaining the property in perfect condition. "Nothing major, just enough to cause problems and cost money. Cut fences, damaged gates, equipment that mysteriously develops problems overnight. Could be coincidence, but it feels like someone's testing our defenses or trying to wear us down through 1,000 small cuts rather than one major confrontation." Jake felt his anger building as he considered the implications of systematic harassment designed to make ranch operations more difficult and expensive. The tactics described by Tom were consistent with the corporate strategies outlined in the Hayes Industries documents, suggesting that the company might already be implementing their pressure campaign against properties they had targeted for acquisition. The realization that his family's ranch was under attack by an enemy he couldn't identify or confront directly made him feel helpless and furious in equal measure. Victoria stepped forward with an expression that suggested she was struggling with internal conflicts about how much to reveal about her own knowledge and concerns. "Have you considered installing security cameras or other monitoring equipment?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes showing genuine worry. "In my experience with rural properties, systematic vandalism is often a precursor to more serious problems. If someone is testing your responses and vulnerabilities, they're probably planning something that will require more comprehensive countermeasures." The advice was sound and well-informed, displaying the kind of security awareness that came from dealing with corporate environments where industrial espionage and competitive sabotage were constant threats. However, Victoria's expertise in areas that should have been far outside her supposed field of specialization continued to raise questions about her true identity and purpose in Copper Creek. Her growing emotional investment in the ranch's problems seemed genuine, but her knowledge of potential solutions suggested connections to resources and experiences that didn't match her consultant cover story. As they rode out to examine the damaged fence line, Jake found himself watching Victoria's interactions with her borrowed horse with increasing fascination. Despite her initial nervousness around large animals, she adapted to riding with the kind of natural grace that suggested either hidden experience or exceptional athletic ability. Her questions about horse behavior and training techniques revealed genuine interest that went beyond mere politeness, and her growing confidence in the saddle suggested someone who was accustomed to mastering new skills quickly when circumstances required adaptation. The fence damage was extensive enough to require several hours of repair work, involving the replacement of multiple sections of wire and the reinstallation of several fence posts that had been deliberately loosened. The systematic nature of the vandalism was clear evidence that whoever had done the damage possessed both specific knowledge of fence construction and a deliberate intent to cause maximum inconvenience rather than random destruction. Jake's suspicions about corporate involvement in the harassment campaign grew stronger as he examined the precise cuts and strategic positioning of the damage. Victoria volunteered to help with the repair work, despite her obvious unfamiliarity with the tools and techniques involved. Her willingness to get her hands dirty and risk damage to her expensive clothes impressed both Jake and Tom, who had initially been skeptical about her motivations for visiting the ranch. As the morning progressed, her determination to contribute meaningfully to the work earned grudging respect from the ranch hands, even though her efforts were more symbolic than practically useful given her lack of experience with fence construction. During a break in the repair work, Victoria surprised Jake by initiating a conversation about the broader challenges facing family ranches in the current economic environment. Her questions revealed sophisticated understanding of agricultural policy, land use regulations, and market dynamics that seemed far beyond what a casual consultant would need to know for general research purposes. When she asked about specific legislative proposals and regulatory changes that could affect ranch operations, Jake began to suspect that her interest in their situation was more personal and immediate than she had been willing to admit. The pressure on family operations has been building for years, Jake explained, wiping sweat from his forehead as he took a water break. Between rising costs and falling prices, a lot of ranchers are barely hanging on. When companies like Hayes Industries come in with offers that are 3 times what the land is worth for agricultural use, it's hard to blame people for taking the money and walking away. The problem is that once enough properties get converted to other uses, the entire community infrastructure that supports ranching starts to collapse. Victoria's expression grew increasingly troubled as Jake described the economic and social pressures that were transforming rural communities throughout the Mountain West. Her questions about the long-term sustainability of traditional ranching operations revealed deep concern about trends that went far beyond academic interest in rural development patterns. When she asked about the specific timeline for Hayes Industries' expansion plans and the company's methods for convincing property owners to sell, Jake began to wonder whether she had personal or professional connections to the development company that she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ben Rodriguez, who had been monitoring radio communications from other ranchers in the area, and brought news that the fence damage at the Lazy H was not an isolated incident. Similar vandalism had been reported at 3 other properties during the night, all of them ranches that had previously been approached by Hayes Industries representatives with acquisition offers. The pattern was too clear to be coincidental, suggesting that the company was implementing a coordinated harassment campaign designed to make ranch operations more difficult and expensive for property owners who had refused their initial offers. Victoria's reaction to this news was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went pale and her hands trembled slightly as she absorbed the implications of systematic corporate sabotage directed against the ranching community. Her emotional response was far too intense for someone whose only connection to the situation was casual research interest. and Jake realized that whatever her true relationship to Hayes Industries might be, she was genuinely distressed by the company's tactics and their impact on the families and communities being targeted. "This is wrong," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying a conviction that seemed to surprise her with its intensity. "No company should be allowed to terrorize families and destroy communities just to increase their profit margins. There have to be legal remedies or regulatory protections that can stop this kind of systematic harassment before it escalates into something even more destructive." Her outrage appeared completely genuine, but her knowledge of potential legal and regulatory solutions suggested access to resources and expertise that didn't match her claimed background as an independent consultant. As they rode back toward the ranch house, Jake found himself reassessing his initial impressions of Victoria and her reasons for being in Copper Creek. Her emotional investment in the community's welfare seemed authentic, and her knowledge of business and legal strategies could prove valuable in organizing resistance to Hayes Industries' expansion plans. However, her continued reluctance to be completely honest about her background and qualifications made him reluctant to trust her with sensitive information or strategic planning that could affect the entire community's future. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows by the time they returned to the Lazy H homestead, where Martha Thompson was waiting on the porch with the kind of patient watchfulness that suggested she had drawn her own conclusions about their visitor's character and motivations. Her greeting to Victoria was warm but searching, and Jake could see his grandmother's keen intelligence at work as she engaged their guest in conversation designed to reveal more about her true nature and purpose in their community. "You look like someone who's had her eyes open to realities she didn't expect to encounter," Martha observed, settling into her chair with the careful movements that had become necessary since her heart condition worsened. "Ranch life has a way of stripping away illusions and forcing people to confront truths they might prefer to avoid. The question is whether you're ready to act on what you've learned, or whether you're just collecting information for purposes you're not ready to share with us." Victoria met Martha's direct gaze with obvious discomfort, clearly struggling with decisions about how much to reveal about her real identity and agenda. Her internal conflict was visible in the way she twisted her hands and avoided eye contact, suggesting someone who was genuinely torn between maintaining her deception and sharing information that could prove crucial to the community's survival. Jake found himself hoping that she would choose honesty over strategy, but he also understood that her hesitation might be based on legitimate concerns about the consequences of premature disclosure. "I came here looking for something I couldn't define," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the weight of confessions that were both personal and professional. "I thought I was conducting research, but I'm beginning to realize that I was actually searching for proof that authentic communities and genuine relationships still existed in a world that seems increasingly artificial and manipulative. What I've found here is more real and valuable than anything I expected. But I'm also discovering that my presence might be more complicated and potentially harmful than I originally intended." The admission was carefully worded but clearly heartfelt, acknowledging the deception while stopping short of complete disclosure about her true identity and connections. Jake appreciated her honesty about the emotional impact of her visit, but he also recognized that she was still withholding crucial information about her background and the specific circumstances that had brought her to Copper Creek. Her growing attachment to the community was evident, but her continued evasion about her real agenda made it difficult to determine whether she could be trusted with sensitive information about their defensive strategies. As evening approached and Victoria prepared to return to her temporary accommodations above Lucy's diner, Jake found himself conflicted about the day's revelations and their implications for the future. Victoria's genuine concern for the community's welfare was encouraging, but her mysterious background and continued evasion about her true purposes made him cautious about sharing too much information about their plans for resisting Hayes Industries' expansion. The stakes were too high to risk exposing their defensive strategies to someone whose loyalties and motivations remained unclear, regardless of how sincere her emotional responses seemed to be. The day's events had revealed Victoria to be more complex and potentially valuable as an ally than Jake had initially expected, but they had also confirmed that she was hiding significant information about her true identity and reasons for being in Copper Creek. Her knowledge of corporate strategies and legal remedies could prove crucial in organizing effective resistance to Hayes Industries. But her reluctance to be completely honest about her background made it impossible to fully trust her with sensitive information that could affect the entire community's survival. As Victoria drove away into the gathering dusk, Jake stood on the porch watching her taillights disappear down the gravel road that led back to town. Martha joined him in the comfortable silence that had characterized their evening conversations for years. But tonight the quiet was filled with questions about trust, deception, and the complex motivations that drove people to make choices that seemed to contradict their stated values and apparent interests. "That young woman is carrying secrets that weigh more than she does," Martha observed, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades spent reading people and understanding the hidden motivations that drove their behavior. "The question is whether those secrets make her dangerous to us or whether they make her someone who needs our help more than she's willing to admit. Either way, she's not what she's pretending to be, and we need to decide how much we're willing to risk, based on what we hope she might become rather than what we know she actually is." Part 4. Community Bonds. The Copper Creek Community Center had witnessed countless gatherings over its 40-year history, from high school graduations to memorial services. But tonight's emergency meeting carried a tension that seemed to press against the wooden walls like a living thing. Jake arrived early, helping to arrange folding chairs in neat rows while trying to organize his thoughts about how much information to share without revealing the source of their intelligence about Hayes Industries' systematic campaign against local ranchers. The stolen corporate documents remained locked in his truck's glove compartment, their explosive contents burning in his consciousness like a guilty secret that demanded action despite the legal and ethical complications of their acquisition. Lucy Chen bustled around the meeting space with characteristic efficiency, setting up coffee urns and arranging homemade cookies on paper plates with the kind of automatic hospitality that had made the Blue Moon Diner the unofficial heart of Copper Creek's social infrastructure. Her movements carried an underlying nervousness that reflected the community's growing awareness that their traditional way of life was under systematic assault by forces beyond their immediate control. As one of the newer residents who had chosen Copper Creek over urban alternatives, Lucy understood better than most what was at stake if Hayes Industries succeeded in transforming the valley into another luxury resort destination. Ben Rodriguez worked alongside Jake to arrange the meeting space, both men careful to avoid discussion of the confidential documents that had revealed the scope of the threat facing their community. The weight of knowledge that couldn't be shared directly was taking its toll on their friendship, creating an artificial distance between two people who had never kept secrets from each other before. The ethical complexity of using stolen information to protect their neighbors while concealing the source of their intelligence created moral tensions that neither man was entirely comfortable navigating. Victoria entered the community center with obvious hesitation, her expensive clothes marking her as an outsider among the assembled ranchers, business owners, and longtime residents who formed Copper Creek's core population. Her presence at what was essentially a private community meeting raised eyebrows and prompted whispered speculation about her identity and motivations. But Jake's subtle nod of acknowledgement gave her permission to stay and observe the proceedings. Her growing emotional investment in the community's welfare was evident in her expression, but her continued reluctance to reveal her true background made her status ambiguous and potentially problematic. Old Pete Jameson occupied his usual seat in the front row, his weathered hands clutching a manila folder that undoubtedly contained the Hayes Industries offer that had prompted this emergency gathering. At 71, Pete commanded respect from every person in the room, and his decision about whether to accept the company's generous terms would influence other property owners who were facing similar pressures. The weight of community expectations was visible in his stooped shoulders and the lines of worry that had deepened around his eyes since the offer arrived 3 days earlier. Doc Williams called the meeting to order with the kind of natural authority that came from decades of serving as the community's unofficial leader in times of crisis. His veterinary practice had made him familiar with every ranch operation in the valley, and his reputation for honesty and practical wisdom made him the logical choice to facilitate discussions about collective responses to external threats. Tonight, however, his usual confident demeanor was subdued by the magnitude of the challenge they were facing and the limited options available for effective resistance. "We all know why we're here," Doc began, his voice carrying across the silent room with the gravity appropriate to the circumstances. "Hayes Industries has made offers to several property owners in our community, and we need to understand what accepting those offers would mean for the rest of us. This isn't just about individual decisions, it's about the survival of Copper Creek as a place where working families can build meaningful lives rather than just a scenic backdrop for wealthy tourists. The room erupted in conversations as neighbors who had been wrestling with these questions in isolation suddenly found themselves able to discuss their concerns openly. Voices rose and fell in overlapping discussions about property values, economic pressures, and the long-term implications of allowing outside corporations to reshape their community according to profit-driven priorities rather than local values and traditions. The complexity of the situation was reflected in the range of opinions expressed, from desperate acceptance of economic realities to determined resistance regardless of financial consequences. Martha Thompson rose slowly from her seat near the middle of the room, and the conversations gradually died away as people realized that the community's eldest member was preparing to speak. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed Copper Creek's evolution from a rough frontier settlement to a stable ranching community, and her perspective bridged generational divides that sometimes complicated collective decision-making processes. "I've lived in this valley for 73 years, Martha began, her words measured and deliberate. I've seen good times and bad times, boom years and drought years, neighbors helping each other through every kind of crisis you can imagine. What I've never seen before is an outside company trying to buy up our entire community and transform it into something that would be unrecognizable to the people who built it with their own hands and their own sweat." Her observation resonated throughout the room, articulating concerns that many residents had been feeling but struggling to express clearly. The Hayes Industries expansion represented more than just economic opportunity. It was a fundamental threat to the social fabric and cultural identity that made Copper Creek a place worth preserving, rather than simply a collection of valuable real estate assets. Martha's ability to frame the issue in terms of community heritage rather than individual financial considerations helped focus the discussion on shared values rather than competing interests. Pete Jameson stood slowly, holding the Hayes Industries contract with trembling hands that reflected both his advanced age and the emotional weight of the decision he was facing. The room fell completely silent as he prepared to it, recognizing that his words would influence the direction of the entire discussion and potentially determine the fate of their community's resistance to corporate transformation. "They're offering me $3 million for property that's been in my family for 42 years, Pete said, his voice breaking slightly with the magnitude of the sum and its implications. "That's more money than I've made in my entire life of ranching, more than enough to ensure that I never have to worry about medical bills or living expenses for whatever time I have left. I'd be lying if I said the offer wasn't tempting, especially when I look at the state of my equipment and the condition of my fences and the bills that keep piling up faster than I can pay them." The honesty of Pete's confession created a moment of uncomfortable recognition among the assembled ranchers, most of whom were facing similar financial pressures and could understand the appeal of Hayes Industries' generous terms. The company's strategy of offering far more than agricultural land was worth created moral as well as economic dilemmas for property owners, who had invested their entire lives in building sustainable operations that were no longer economically viable under current market conditions. Victoria listened to Pete's words with visible distress, her hands clenched in her lap and her face pale with what appeared to be genuine anguish about the human cost of corporate strategies that she obviously understood better than anyone else in the room. Her emotional response was too intense for casual observer, and Jake realized that whatever her connection to Hayes Industries might be, she was genuinely horrified by the impact of the company's tactics on families and communities that had no effective means of resistance. "But I also know what accepting that money would mean for the rest of you," Pete continued, his voice growing stronger as he articulated the community values that had guided his entire adult life. "If I sell to Hayes Industries, it opens the door for them to approach every other property owner with similar offers backed by the implied threat that holdouts will be surrounded by development whether they like it or not. My decision affects everyone in this room, and I can't make it based solely on what's best for me personally." The recognition that individual property decisions would have collective consequences shifted the tone of the meeting from personal financial considerations to strategic community planning. If Hayes Industries succeeded in acquiring key properties, they would gain leverage to pressure remaining landowners through systematic harassment and economic manipulation until the entire valley was under corporate control. The documents that Jake and Ben had reviewed revealed exactly this strategy, but they couldn't share that intelligence without exposing their source and potentially destroying their only pipeline to early warning about the company's future plans. Tom Mitchell stood to address the gathering, his practical experience as a ranch foreman providing a different perspective on the economic realities that were driving Hayes Industries' expansion strategy. The problem isn't just the immediate offers, Tom observed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood ranch operations from the ground up. The problem is what happens to the ranches that don't sell. Once Hayes Industries controls enough property to influence local infrastructure and services, they can make life difficult for holdouts through political pressure and economic manipulation that's perfectly legal but designed to force compliance. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Tom described tactics that were clearly familiar to her from corporate environments where competitive pressure and strategic intimidation were standard business practices. Her knowledge of such methods was evident in her expression, but her obvious distress about their application to rural communities suggested that she had never considered the human cost of strategies that were routine in her professional world. The disconnect between corporate objectives and community welfare was becoming real to her in ways that abstract business theories had never accomplished. Lucy Chen raised her hand to request recognition, and Doc Williams nodded for her to proceed. As a relative newcomer who had chosen Copper Creek over urban alternatives, Lucy's perspective bridged the gap between insider knowledge and outsider objectivity that made her observations particularly valuable in discussions about community identity and future direction. I moved here from San Francisco 15 years ago because I was tired of living in a place where everything was about making money rather than making connections, Lucy said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had made difficult choices based on personal values rather than financial opportunities. What I found in Copper Creek was a community where people still believed in helping each other, where success was measured by the strength of your relationships rather than the size of your bank account. If we let Hayes Industries transform this place into another luxury resort, we'll lose the very things that make it worth preserving. Her words resonated with many of the longtime residents who had watched other rural communities succumb to development pressures and emerge as shallow imitations of their former selves, preserved only as tourist attractions rather than living communities where working families could build meaningful lives. The specter of Copper Creek becoming another Jackson Hole or Aspen, beautiful but unaffordable for the people who had created their unique character, hung over the discussion like a warning from a possible future that no one wanted to accept. Ben Rodriguez finally stood to share information that he and Jake had been struggling to present without revealing its confidential source. I've been doing some research on Hayes Industries and their expansion strategies, Ben said carefully, choosing his words to convey essential information without compromising his cousin's position within the company. What I've learned suggests that their approach is more systematic and aggressive than we might have expected. They're not just making generous offers, they're actively working to make it more difficult for ranchers to remain in business through various forms of economic and political pressure. The revelation that Hayes Industries was engaged in systematic harassment rather than simple property acquisition created a stir of angry murmurs throughout the room. Jake watched Victoria's reaction carefully, noting the way her face went pale and her hands trembled as Ben described tactics that were obviously familiar to her from personal experience. Her emotional response confirmed his growing suspicion that she had direct knowledge of Hayes Industries' operations, but her obvious distress about their methods suggested that she might be more potential ally than enemy if approached correctly. "What kind of pressure are we talking about?" asked Frank Morrison, the hardware store owner whose business depended on the ranching community's continued prosperity. His question reflected the concerns of local merchants who understood that their economic survival was directly tied to the health of the agricultural operations that formed Copper Creek's economic foundation. Ben glanced at Jake before responding, both men acutely aware that they were walking a fine line between sharing essential information and revealing sources that needed protection. From what I understand, the company uses a variety of tactics including political lobbying for regulatory changes that make ranching more expensive, partnerships with financial institutions to restrict agricultural credit, and various forms of low-level harassment designed to make operations more difficult and costly. The description was accurate without being specific enough to compromise the confidential documents that had revealed Hayes Industries' comprehensive strategy. However, Victoria's reaction to Ben's carefully worded explanation was immediate and unmistakable. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths as though she was fighting nausea or overwhelming emotional distress. Her response was far too intense for someone whose only connection to the situation was casual research interest. Doc Williams recognized that the meeting was approaching a critical decision point and called for focused discussion about potential responses to Hayes Industries' systematic pressure campaign. The question before us is whether we're going to resist these tactics collectively or whether we're going to let them divide us into individual property owners who can be pressured separately until they wear down our resistance through attrition. The room fell silent as people contemplated the implications of organized resistance versus individual capitulation to corporate pressure. Collective action would require unprecedented cooperation among fiercely independent ranchers who had never needed to coordinate their operations or share strategic information with neighbors. However, the alternative was almost certainly the systematic destruction of their community through corporate manipulation and economic warfare that no individual operation could survive alone. Victoria stood suddenly, her face pale but her expression determined as she prepared to speak to a room full of strangers who had no reason to trust her judgment or value her opinions. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice shaking with the weight of confessions that would change everything about her relationship with the community and potentially destroy the trust she had been building with Jake and the others who had welcomed her into their world. The room turned toward her with expressions ranging from curious to suspicious, recognizing that whatever she was about to reveal would either establish her credibility as a legitimate ally or expose her as a potential threat to their collective security. Jake felt his heart racing as he watched Victoria struggle with decisions that would define not only her future relationship with Copper Creek but also the community's assessment of whether she could be trusted with sensitive information about their defensive strategies. "My name is Victoria Hayes," she said quietly, the words falling into the silent room like stones into still water. "Hayes Industries is my company, and everything you've described about their tactics is not only true but worse than you imagine. I came here under false pretenses, but what I've found has made me realize that the corporate strategies I approved are destroying communities and families in ways that I never fully understood until I experienced your kindness and witnessed your struggles firsthand." The revelation created chaos in the community center as people processed the implications of having the enemy in their midst during discussions of their most sensitive defensive strategies. Voices rose in anger and confusion as neighbors who had been speaking freely about their vulnerabilities and concerns realized that every word had been heard by the very person responsible for the threats they were facing. Jake felt betrayed and furious, his growing feelings for Victoria transforming instantly into bitter recognition that he had been manipulated by someone whose professional expertise included exactly the kind of deception she had practiced so successfully. Victoria stood frozen in the center of the storm, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the community's rage and disappointment. Her confession had been necessary for both ethical and practical reasons, but the timing and manner of her revelation had destroyed any possibility of maintaining the relationship she had come to value more than the corporate empire that bore her family's name. The woman who had claimed not to have smiled genuinely in years was now crying in front of strangers who had every reason to hate her for the deception that had brought her into their lives. Part 5. The Corporate Truth. The luxurious penthouse office that occupied the top floor of the Hayes Industries building in Denver seemed like a different planet compared to the rustic community center where Victoria had just destroyed her carefully constructed cover story.